Human nature dictates that we don't just become good citizens without something to keep us in check of our wilder impulses.
The bail system needs to be looked at, and the conditions of bail, if bail is granted, need to be far more realistic. Such things as reporting 3 times a day.
3 times a day is a lot.
If that's what is necessary to make sure the person turns up.
Wow. Hello everyone. Welcome to the new episode of Smart Talk. I am Eunice Young, a legislative counsellor and a barrister. It's my great honor today to have 2 special guests, Mr. Oscar KWOK, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Hong Kong Police Force, and Mr. Grenville Cross, who is a Senior Counsel, a law professor, and the previous Director of Public Prosecution. And today we are going to discuss 2 main topics, which is on the separation of powers and whether there will be a judicial reform. Okay, we have the heated debate on separation of powers. And as I know that Deng Xiaoping back from 1987, he said that separation of powers will never be applied in Hong Kong. But why we have that such an issue as a heated debate in nowadays, like now we are in 2020? Why suddenly we are bringing up whether we have the separation of powers in Hong Kong? But as our CE said in public, we are having the executive-led of system.
行政長官林鄭月娥喺行政會議前話三權分立係錯誤理解。
So what system are we having, Mr. Cross?
Well, quite clearly we do have an executive-led system. Not only the CE says that, but that's implicit also in the basic law. And indeed the courts of Hong Kong have also said the same thing. And it's quite clear from some of the debate that takes place that people aren't really familiar with the issue, because quite clearly China is a unitary state. And all the powers that are exercised by the regions and other parts of China derive from the central authorities. The various organs of government, including the judiciary in Hong Kong, all move in the same direction. They all have the same basic goal, which is maintaining prosperity and stability in Hong Kong, as well as protecting national unity and territorial integrity. And once one appreciates that, one can see that the debate about the separation of powers probably springs from a great deal of ignorance with people who haven't really taken the time to study what the basic law actually says. But once one appreciates that, one can then proceed to the next stage, which is acknowledging that under our present system there are nonetheless various divisions of responsibility. Of course, the executive has its own responsibilities, the legislature has its responsibilities, and the judiciary has its own responsibilities, and of course they do function independently of each other. Obviously the whole idea of separation of powers originated in Europe, I suppose, in the 18th century. It's practiced to an extent in United Kingdom, United States and elsewhere, but by no means as much as some people seem to think. There is a great deal of overlap.
Yeah, so what about in the enforcement unit's perspective? What do you think about the executive-led system, or whether we have separation of powers, or is it some overlapping between those?
Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that this is not something that we should engage in as an ideological contest. Okay, separation of powers is a broad concept. It's never really minutely defined to the nth degree. And like Grenville said, okay, it is practiced to different extents. Okay, even in Europe, in America, and for police officers, we don't actually have to think about those. Okay, our only guideline is to actually enforce the law according to the law. What I think is, okay, I think people need to understand, okay, when we talk about separation of powers, okay, ultimately, what is it there for? It is there for the purpose of ensuring that there are checks and balances. In a practical sense, okay, we do have checks and balances. And I think I just quote an example regarding police work. We investigate cases, we bring criminals to court, and we earnestly believe that people we bring to court are guilty, because otherwise how do we do a job? How do we actually put our cases together? So in that earnest belief that someone that we put to court are guilty, we make them available to the court process, and we accept that the court might find them not guilty. So the checks and balances are there, okay? The different arms of the establishment, okay? They actually function independently in that regard. So I think for the average citizen and us as police officers, the important thing is that we operate within the bounds of the law that applies to us, and we accept the checks and balances that apply to us as well.
I understand that the check and balances are, of course, over the three pillars, right? Administrative, legislative, and the judicial powers. And of course, now we understand that over the central government, that we are accountable to the central government as well. That's why we think that for the public's interest to know that we have no separation of powers between these three, because we also have the central government to step in, right? So how are we going to do the promotion to this new, it's not new ideas, but yeah, it's not something new, but how are we going to do the promotion for this, for the public?
I think it is important to, well, like I said, okay, this is not an ideological contest, okay? The three pillars, they exist for a reason. They do not exist in a vacuum, they do not exist for their own sake. They are there as part of the governance system of a society, and this is true for the whole world. So I think people should not forget that they are there to serve some common good for the entire society. So when we talk about separation of power, whether you say that there is or there is not, okay, it's a moot point. Because at the end of the day, these authorities, these different pillars have to function for the good of the society. And I think that's the important point. Nobody should think that simply because there is a certain way of putting things in a document or not in the document, that they somehow gain the right to go off on a tangent. You have total disregard to the overall good of the society.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you were quite right earlier on to make the point that Deng Xiaoping had indicated that separation of powers wasn't really relevant for Hong Kong in the future. But as I said earlier on, even though we don't have a strict separation of powers, we do nonetheless have a division of responsibilities. And we see that very clearly, of course, in relation to the judiciary, where the basic law does provide for it to operate independently in the exercise of judicial discretion, free from any interference. So that's a very important area in which they are divided off and given special protections from the legislature, from the executive, and indeed from anyone else. So once people understand that even though, as Oscar says, it doesn't really matter what label you put on it, how things are actually operating in practice, then I think that provides a far greater degree of reassurance to some people who might otherwise be confused about the debate.
Yeah.
Much of the debate is actually fairly artificial, with people trying to decide what is the best label to put on the product.
Yes.
But when one comes down to it, as I say, if one thinks of it in terms of division of responsibility, then it's perhaps rather easier to comprehend.
Yeah, if we move on to the judicial process, like there are some public comments, and they worry about that. Why some of the judges, they seems like they are biased when they're giving out judgment, or while they're giving comments during the mitigation process, or even whether they are going to give them bail conditions. It makes the society a bit worried. It's a worrying situation, or whether we start from there, whether we should have the judicial reform because of the judges, the comments. How are they going to put influences, the political influences, into the judicial process? Do you think that it is the only way out? Whether the judicial reform is the only way out to put it aside, or how to make the judicial more impartial in this sense?
Well, you have to remember, you mentioned that some people criticise the judges for being unrealistic in terms of sentencing and in relation to bail. Some people, of course, criticise them the other way. Yeah. They say that they're far too strict. And you have to remember as well that there are, I don't know the exact figure, there must be about some 100 judges and magistrates all told. So far as I know, by and large, the judges themselves, the High Court judges, the Court of Final Appeal judges, the District Court judges, haven't really faced much criticism at all. And where there has been criticism, it's been over several decisions which have been taken in the Magistrates' Court. It may well be that some of those are justified, and the judiciary can deal with those things in its own way. I mean, if serious mistakes have been made by magistrates, for example, in terms of granting bail to someone who shouldn't have bail, or imposing a sentence which is too lenient, then there are mechanisms in place for those matters to be redressed. The Secretary for Justice can seek an appeal. Clearly, if a particular magistrate is continually making mistakes or taking decisions which are contrary to law, then clearly the judiciary will have to decide how to handle that. But as I say, there are mechanisms in place, and the judiciary certainly has to be more transparent if it can. That's one of the points I think you properly made. And of course, the present Chief Justice, Geoffrey Ma, did actually introduce a special mechanism in 2016 when he brought forward the Secretariat for complaints against judicial conduct. So anyone who has a complaint against the judiciary, for example in relation to bias or impoliteness or whatever it may be, they can lodge a complaint with that Secretariat, and it will then be comprehensively investigated. And in July, of course, Chief Justice Ma went one step further, and he announced that in future, again to make the process a bit more transparent, some of the complaints and the responses which the judiciary supply in relation to those complaints will actually be put online, so members of the public who want to know more can actually study things. But I have to say that even though it's very easy for people to criticise particular judges, one often does find when one studies the details of the case that there's rather more to it than met the eye, because many people just see a very short report of a judgment in the newspaper next day, and they really don't have a full picture, which is why the Chief Justice, Geoffrey Ma, has always said that complaints are fine, but make sure they are informed complaints. And so, for example, with sentencing, clearly some of the magistrates have sometimes made mistakes, but nonetheless it's a very difficult exercise to sentence people, particularly when they're very young, by which I mean under 16. It's very difficult, and there are numerous mitigating factors which the courts have to weigh up. It's never an easy exercise, and sometimes mistakes are made. But unless one knows all the factors that have been put into the sentencing exercise, then it can be difficult to jump to a conclusion that it's a wrong decision. But that having been said, some mistakes are being made. They are being appealed by the Secretary for Justice. In some cases, bail is being granted when it should not be granted. And I would like to see more training provided, particularly for magistrates. As you well know, Eunice, they have the Judicial Institute, which was previously the Judicial Studies Board, and that's headed by a High Court judge. And that provides fairly comprehensive training in different areas for the judiciary.
But how often they have such
Well, I don't
training?
know. I'm not familiar with the details. I know this institute is there.
No one ever said it.
No, but I mean, this is something that I'd like to see them looking more at, and perhaps telling us a bit more about. As Oscar well knows, the situation in relation to the granting of bail has changed enormously over the last year. Various countries have suspended their extradition arrangements with Hong Kong. So offenders here in Hong Kong, people who've been accused, know that if they can escape and go to one of those countries, they will be safe, and there's no chance of them being sent back to face justice. Some countries have, like Germany, for example, have allowed people who are on bail to claim asylum there, even though they are facing serious riot charges here in Hong Kong. So the bail system needs to be looked at, and the conditions of bail, if bail is granted, need to be far more realistic. Such things as reporting 3 times a day.
3 times a day is a lot.
If that's what is necessary to make sure the person turns up.
Wow.
So you see these type of things, and the traditional things such as surrender of documents, night curfews, be at home by 8 p.m. Until 7 a.m. So if bail is granted, then you have to look at these type of conditions to make sure that people won't abscond. And again, I would have thought that the Judicial Institute could consider organising a seminar for the magistrates who are dealing with bail cases, actually explaining how the landscape has changed over the last year, and how the risk of abscondment is really much greater now. And if the magistrates have this clearly explained to them by people who really know what they're talking about, then I think they'd have a rather more realistic approach to the granting of bail. So these are some of the things that can be looked at. And of course, the Judicial Institutes can also provide talks on sentencing. So if some magistrates are regularly imposing sentences which are unrealistic, and which after they're examined are actually wrong, then it could well be that they will benefit from a seminar on particular aspects of sentencing, at which they can ask experts, which sentences are appropriate in this type of situation and which aren't. So the institute is there. It's a matter of making sure that it's properly utilised.
Yeah, I think if everything made it more clear, it will be easier for the police to administer or to do the enforcement as well. Oscar, do you have any further comments on Mr. Cross' comments and also on judicial independence?
Well, first of all, I would say I echo Grenville's point about the need for more realistic bail terms to be given, because the environment has changed dramatically because of the breakdown of our relationship, with many countries, and the cancellation of the extradition treaties. So if there was a high risk for these people to disappear, now the risks are even higher. So I think the court has to reflect that in their decisions to grant bail to criminals who are involved in serious crime. And we police are of course concerned about whether people are going to be available for trial.
Yeah.
Yes. On the question of judicial independence, I need to start first with by saying that the police force fully respects the authority of the courts and the independence of the judiciary. And as a police officer, it is not my job to criticize in any way the functioning of the judiciary. So I'm not going to do that. But perhaps what I can do is to provide an additional perspective from which to understand the issue of the judiciary, how it functions, how it actually defend the rule of law, and how it actually contributes to the maintenance of law and order in a society. This is something that I think most people have missed, in all the discussions about what has happened in Hong Kong in the past year. My first point is that when we talk about judicial independence, when we focus only on judicial independence and its freedom from interference, it is very easy for us to forget that these two guarantees, they concern only the manner in which the judiciary functions. They say nothing about the objectives that the judiciary is supposed to achieve in the end. The guarantees are written into the basic law, but the objectives are not. This is because the objectives are self-evident. They are assumed, and I don't think there can be many arguments about what those objectives are. One, to achieve justice for everyone in the society. Everyone means culprits, victims of crime, ordinary law-abiding citizens, and society as a whole. Two, to defend the rule of law, especially when it is being attacked directly. So, I quote you an example. When the notion that a citizen is entitled to break the law in order to achieve some self-proclaimed noble causes.
我哋嘅基本權利受到剝削，我哋仲可以同佢講話，我哋要溝通妥協，仲有得妥協咩？仲有退路可以退咩？我完全睇唔到有退路，就係因為睇唔到有退路，我哋先至會走出嚟，拋頭顱，灑熱血。
When this idea is being openly preached to the public, and certain people actually put the idea into action, and in the process commit murder, arson, and other serious crimes, then the question of whether these objectives have been sufficiently achieved by the judiciary has become a legitimate question. Because, like I said before, no one pillar, actually exists, for its own sake, It is there to serve the overall public good. The second point I want to make is that the state of good law and order is not the natural, inevitable condition of human societies. People as a whole need to be deterred from committing crime if they are to be law-abiding. Human nature dictates that we don't just become good citizens without something to keep us in check of our wilder impulses. This is true for any society, and I think for Hong Kong especially, because we are such a free society. We achieve this deterrence by constantly and consistently making people believe that any law-breaking behavior will be met with the unambiguous disapproval of the courts and invite deterrent sentences upon conviction of criminals. But we, the police, can only investigate and collect evidence. If this is not followed by prosecutions and convictions and then deterrent sentences passed down by the court, then no deterrence can result from this process. When there is widespread law-breaking behavior that is publicly broadcast on TV on an hourly basis for months,
有人向佢潑水，又出拳打佢。
Oh my god! Oh my god!
as has been the case, okay, in Hong Kong for 8-9 months, okay, in the last year. This deterrent message that I talked about is about the only thing that can keep the society from slipping into complete lawlessness. And as I've said, good law and order does not just come naturally by itself. It has to be actively maintained by the authorities. And the police just happens to be on the front end of that equation. We can't do this job alone, because the goods that needs to be delivered at the end of the process can only be delivered by the courts. We cannot be the only ones who care about the maintenance of law and order in Hong Kong, because truly we are not the only authority vested with that very important public duty.
Yeah. So we talk about law and order, the rule of law, and some separation of powers, whether or not we have it or not. But will this undermine what we are having, the judicial independence? Because some said that judicial is not just independence, there's supremacy. So how are we going to see the relationship between the judicial process, judicial powers, and the other two powers? How are we going to do the check and balance, or whether it is over some of the other powers, the other two powers?
Well, obviously, if the government doesn't like particular decisions of the court, then it's open to the government to bring forward laws to change the law in that particular area. That's what happens throughout the common law world. And of course, any changes which were made would also have to be consistent with the Hong Kong Bill of Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which applies to Hong Kong. But just picking up on Oscar's point, he's quite right to say that political violence is just as serious as other types of violence and must be punished appropriately. And you were talking about judicial reform. Some people, of course, have been saying that judges need a sentencing council, which is perhaps a rather simplistic solution, but some of them seem to think that if there was a sentencing council, it would issue guidelines which the courts would have to follow, and that this would remove the discretion which they have now to impose the sentences which they think to be correct. In fact, the question of a sentencing council was considered some years ago by the Criminal Court Users Committee, which represents all the stakeholders. I was sitting on the committee that time, and the view was taken by everyone that it wasn't really suitable for Hong Kong. And one of the reasons was that Hong Kong was a very small place, and the courts are fully aware of what's happening throughout Hong Kong, unlike in England and Wales, which is obviously far larger, but also because the Court of Appeal regularly issues guidelines on sentencing, having conducted very thorough exercises, and those guidelines have worked very well in particular areas. As you know, Eunice, for example, in relation to drug trafficking, they're very detailed guidelines covering trafficking in certain amounts of drugs, and these have been very useful in terms of punishment and also of deterrence. People often talk about riots. They say we should have guidelines for riots. But what they don't appreciate was that just last year, the Court of Appeal actually gave clear guidance as to the factors which go into sentencing riot cases. For example, they said if there's a lot of people involved, then a more severe penalty will be necessary. If it's premeditated, planned, higher penalties will be appropriate. If a lot of damage is caused, if it goes on for a long time, these are the type of factors which will result in higher sentences for people who engage in rioting. And looking at the type of sentences which have been imposed in the past few months, one sees a trend developing that it's normally somewhere between 4 and 7 years imprisonment. So to that extent, the advice which has been given by the Court of Appeal is being heeded, and quite severe sentences are being imposed. So it's important to keep in mind that the Court of Appeal has actually done a lot, and will doubtless do more in future, as and when it's asked to do so by prosecutors if they feel that sentencing guidelines in any new area is required. So basically what I'm saying is that the judiciary does have the mechanisms internally to address many of the concerns which people are sometimes expressing.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to add a point about this this trend of attacking the judiciary. Well, first of all, I won't express any opinion in regard to any particular cases, but I think it is important that people know that in the past few years, there's been a trend that people seem to engage in the attack of the authorities. The police happens to be one, and the government is the usual target. I think it needs to be pointed out that no society can function properly without some kind of authority in charge and respected by the general public. And I think we are in a state where most other authorities have been attacked so much that you can't say that they have their reputation or credibility completely intact. So we have to be careful, this extreme characterization of one or two cases to generalize about the whole establishment. First of all, it is unfair. Secondly, if you succeed in destroying the credibility of the judiciary, it will be mayhem for everyone. It will be chaos, because the judiciary actually happens to be the last defense of this society. So I would really say that let's be careful, let's be fair, let's be objective, just like Grenville said, if you have any criticism, it had better be based on good facts and good grounds.
Yeah, I understand that most of the public, of course, they only read the news and only a few of the lines from